They told her she'd inherited a ghost, a sliver of land so worthless it became a punchline in the sterile corridors of the system. What waited there wasn't just a home, it was a reckoning. And if you've ever felt like someone else held the pen to your story, stay. You might recognize yourself in what comes next. If you do, hit that subscribe button. This is a place for stories like ours. The day I turned 18 was the day I officially stopped existing. 2 years as a ward of the state, a file in a cabinet, a name on a roster. Case file 734, Ara Vance, orphan. My 18th birthday wasn't cake and candles. It was an eviction from the only life I'd ever known. Mrs. Gable, the group home director, summoned me to her office. Stale coffee and lemon disinfectant. The official cologne of institutional compassion. She wore that expression, the one engineered to look caring, but drained of everything except exhaustion. A face that said, quote, 0. She pushed a manila envelope across her particle board desk, thin, insultingly thin. Quote 1. The word floated between us like something stolen from another life. Inheritance. A word for people with family portraits on walls and last names that opened doors. Not for a girl whose roots grew through the cracked concrete of state-run facilities. I was sure it was a sick joke. My parents were gone. A wreck of fire and black ice on a winter highway when I was 16. Grandparents? Some dim, waterlogged memory of a woman whose hands carried the scent of soil and lavender. But she disappeared from my world long before the crash. A ghost born from a ghost. Mrs. Gable tapped one manicured nail against the envelope. It's from your maternal grandmother, Eleanor Vance. The state tracked down her will. It's modest. She said modest the way a doctor says inoperable, a word designed to cushion the blow that only sharpens its edge. I undid the clasp. Inside, a single iron key, rust-spotted and heavy. A folded, yellowed document, a deed. It transferred to me 1 acre of land in a town I'd never heard of, Northwood, Vermont. 1 acre and a barn. Nothing else. No house, no savings account, just a rectangle of frozen earth and a structure probably collapsing under its own weight, hundreds of miles north in the coldest reach of the country. I looked at Mrs. Gable. My face gave away nothing. I'd trained that reflex out of myself years ago. Disappointment was oxygen in this place. Constant, invisible, unremarkable. A barn? My voice landed flat as pavement. That's it. She offered a thin, pressed smile. Sometimes a fresh start is the best inheritance, dear. A piece of land is something. It's yours. It didn't feel like mine. It felt like a punishment. One last cosmic joke aimed at a girl who already had nothing. The other kids heard about it fast. It turned into a running gag. Quote 6, quote 7. They weren't trying to wound me. This was how we survived. We mined absurdity from tragedy because it was the only currency we controlled. They laughed at my worthless inheritance because laughing was easier than facing their own terror, their own approaching 18th birthdays, their own empty envelopes, their own walk through that front door into nothing. I kept the key in my pocket, cold, heavy, a solid fragment of a past I couldn't decode and a future I couldn't picture. A bus ticket. $100 in state-issued transition funds. And a key to a barn. That was my launch into the world. Walking out of the group home for the last time, I didn't turn around. Nothing back there worth seeing, just a building full of ghosts in training, lined up and waiting for their turn to be released into the void. The bus ride was long, rattling, a slow passage through the skeletal remains of late autumn. The farther north we crawled, the more the world bled out its color. Tired greens and city browns gave way to a stark canvas of gray and white. Snow came. Not the soft postcard kind, hard, driven, flakes that fell like they meant to erase everything beneath them. I pressed my forehead to the glass and watched the landscape transform. Strip malls and gas stations dissolving into dense stands of pine and birch, branches already bowing under the weight of white. The bus carried almost nobody, just me and a handful of strangers, each sealed inside our own silence. Mine was anything but peaceful. It churned with a cold, low-burning anger. Why would she do this? This grandmother, Eleanor. Why leave me a worthless scrap of land in the middle of nowhere? If she'd cared even slightly, she would have left money, a letter, some explanation for why she'd been a ghost my entire life, especially after my parents died. The deed felt like a slap. The key, a riddle I didn't have the strength to untangle. All I had was her name, a phantom handing me a phantom property. I pressed my forehead to the frozen window glass. The engine's low vibration matched the dull hum rattling inside my skull. My plan, if it deserved that word, was straightforward. Get to Northwood, find a real estate agent, sell the land for whatever it would bring, a few hundred, maybe 1,000 if luck decided to visit. Then take that money and vanish into some city, a cheap apartment, a dishwashing job, survival. That was the only skill anyone had ever bothered teaching me. I pulled the deed from my backpack. The paper was thick, almost fabric, the ink washed pale by time. I scanned the legal description, a tangle of coordinates and boundary lines that meant nothing. Then I noticed something tucked into the fold. A smaller sheet, newer. A letter. Not from my grandmother. From a law firm, Blackwood & Sons, real estate development. The language was polished, professional, and completely hollow. Addressed to the estate of Eleanor Vance. They were aware of the property transfer. They were prepared to make a generous offer to acquire the land as part of a larger development project. $5,000. To me, that number was a universe, a skeleton key to a locked door, enough to rent an apartment for a year, buy groceries, breathe. The letter was dated 1 week ago. They'd been watching the probate process, tracking it like predators track wounded prey. My first reaction hit like a wave, pure, drowning relief. This was my way out. I wouldn't need to spend more than a single day in Northwood. Find their office, sign the papers, catch the next bus, headed anywhere else. But then something else surfaced. A small, stubborn splinter of suspicion. Why the eagerness? Why would a development company chase down one isolated acre with nothing on it but a rotting barn? $5,000 wasn't generous for land they truly wanted. It was a lowball bid for something they needed desperately, for reasons they weren't sharing. It felt too clean, and life had hammered one lesson into me. Nothing was ever that clean. The bus groaned, slowing as it rolled into a small depot dusted with snow. A lone sign read, Quote 8. The doors hissed apart. Arctic air struck me like a fist, cold so deep it had edges. I stepped down, my thin jacket worthless against the wind. The town crouched beneath a heavy quilt of fresh snow. The sky was a flat, merciless white. I was the only passenger who got off. The bus pulled away, its red tail lights swallowed by swirling flakes, and then I was standing there, utterly, completely alone. For a long moment I didn't move. The developer's letter in one hand, the iron key cold against my thigh through the pocket lining. Two paths. Take the money and run, or walk into whatever this place was hiding. For the first time in years, the decision belonged to me. That was the most frightening part. I yanked my collar higher, wind slicing at my cheeks, and started toward the town's single blinking traffic light. My boots broke through the untouched snow with each step. Northwood wasn't really a town, more like the idea of one. A main street lined with a handful of two-story buildings, their facades scoured raw by decades of punishing winters. A general store, a post office, a diner with a neon sign that buzzed and flickered, a small office bearing a shingle, Thompson Law. The rest were houses, plain and solid, chimney smoke curling upward like slow exhales. Everything lay muffled under snow. The whole place felt like it was holding its breath. I headed for the general store first. A bell rang when I shouldered open the heavy wooden door, and warm air poured over me, carrying the scent of wood smoke, coffee, and sawdust. A white-bearded old man in suspenders glanced up from behind the counter, newspaper spread before him. He studied me over the rim of his glasses, expression flat, but those eyes, sharp as broken glass. Quote 9, he said, not a question. Quote 10, I replied. My voice sounded thin against all that quiet. Quote 11. Something shifted in him. His spine straightened. His eyes went soft with recognition, or maybe pity. He removed his glasses, polished them with a cloth. Quote 12. Quote, he said, voice like a low rumble of distant thunder. Quote 13. Quote, his gaze moved across my face, searching. Quote 14. Quote, I had no words for that. It was like someone pressing a puzzle piece into my hand, one I never knew was missing. Quote underscore 15. Quote, the words escaped before I could catch them. Bill shook his head, slow and deliberate. Quote 16. He pointed toward the back of the store. Quote 17. His eyes traveled down to my thin jacket, my worn-out sneakers. Quote 18. I shook my head. My $100 had to stretch. A taxi was out of the question. Bill let out a sigh, heavy, almost paternal. Quote 19. Quote, I tried to protest. He shut it down with a wave. Quote 20. Quote, I obeyed. My hands trembled as I filled a styrofoam cup with dark, steaming liquid. The warmth crept into my fingers, a small mercy in a world that felt enormous and cold. While I waited, a sleek black SUV pulled up outside. A man stepped out wearing a tailored overcoat and expensive shoes. He looked like he'd been cut from a different cloth than this entire town. He walked in, eyes sweeping the room before settling on me. Something about his movements felt rehearsed, too smooth. You must be Miss Vance, he said. His voice had the texture of polished stone. I'm Mark Corrigan from Blackwood & Sons. He extended a hand. I left it hanging. The developer. We sent you a letter. I was hoping we could discuss our offer. Bill moved out from behind the counter, positioning himself between us. Casual, but deliberate. The girl just got into town, Mark. Give her a minute to breathe. Corrigan's smile never touched his eyes. underscore underscore quote underscore 25 underscore underscore. He pressed a business card into my fingers. Quote underscore 26 quote. A curt nod to Bill. Then he was gone, the door chime marking his exit. The silence he left behind had weight. Quote underscore 27 quote, Bill said. His voice dropped low, pulled tight. He fixed me with a serious look. An hour later, Bill locked the store and walked me to his old pickup. The thing rattled like it was held together by habit. The heater blasted warm, dusty air as we pulled out of town, headlights carving through falling snow. Beyond the windows, nothing but swirling white and black. We rode without speaking, just the rhythmic slap of windshield wipers, the muffled crunch of tires biting into snow. Bill said at last, eyes steady on the road. We turned onto a narrower road, unploughed. The truck groaned, tires clawing for grip. Then I saw it. Set back from the road, half swallowed by snow-heavy pines, stood the barn. Larger than anything I'd pictured. Grey wood, weathered and scarred. The roof bowed at its center like a broken back, and one of the main doors hung at a drunken angle from rusted hinges. This wasn't a building. It was decay wearing a building's shape. It looked like something that didn't want visitors. Bill eased the truck to a stop. Quote, 32. Quote, he said, quiet. Quote, 33. Quote, he glanced at me. Quote, 34. Quote, I stared at the barn, dark, desolate, hostile. But it was mine, the only thing on this earth that belonged to me. Quote, 35. Quote, I said, forcing steadiness into my voice. Quote, 36. Quote, he nodded, unconvinced. Quote, 37. Quote, I promised I would. I climbed out of the truck, my boots sinking into deep snow. Bill waited until I reached the path before shifting into reverse, his headlights dragging across the face of the structure, then vanishing down the road. The silence that followed was total. Just me, the falling snow, and that hulking dark shape. I drew a breath so cold it scorched my lungs, and pulled the old iron key from my pocket. It felt ancient, even through my gloves. I walked to the smaller side door, the one still on its hinges. The lock was seized with rust and cold. For one terrible second, I was sure the key wouldn't turn. Then, a loud, grinding screech. The mechanism surrendered. The door groaned inward, opening into a mouth of absolute darkness. The air that poured out was stale and frigid, carrying old hay, dust, and something harder to name. Something like memory. I stood on the threshold, frozen. This was the moment. Tomb or beginning? I fumbled for the tiny flashlight on my keychain, its beam pitiful against the dark, and stepped inside. The door swung shut behind me with a heavy, final thud. My little flashlight threw a feeble lance of light into the vaulted interior. The space was enormous, far larger than the outside suggested. The ceiling climbed into a lattice of rafters lost in shadow. Dust motes swirled through the beam like panicked spirits. To my left, old animal stalls stood with their wooden gates bleached grey by time. To my right, a chaos of shapes hid beneath dusty canvases, farm equipment, stacked lumber, objects I couldn't identify. The floor was packed earth, cold and unyielding under my feet. Straight ahead, at the barn's far end, a walled-off section formed a small room within the larger structure. A workbench sat just outside it, buried under tools and jars of screws and nails, everything sealed beneath a thick skin of dust. The silence was oppressive, not just quiet, a dense, living silence, loaded with unspoken history. I felt like a trespasser in a place that had been sleeping for years. I began searching methodically, sweeping the flashlight across every surface, looking for anything that could tell me about the woman who had lived here, who had died here. Anything that could crack this place open and make it speak. The stalls held nothing but dry, brittle straw. The equipment was rusted into permanence. I yanked back one of the canvases and choked as dust erupted into the air. Beneath it sat an old tractor, its red paint faded to a tired pink, tires flat and split with age. A fossil. There was nothing of value here, nothing that explained why a developer would offer $5,000 for this wreck. My chest tightened. Corgan had been right. This place was a liability. I should have taken the money. What was I doing out here alone in the dark, in the cold, chasing a dead woman's shadow? The anger came back hot. A cruel trick, leaving me this hollow shell. I moved to the workbench. The tools were old but meticulously maintained, arranged with a precision that contradicted the barn's disorder. Wrenches and hammers hung from a pegboard, each outline traced in white paint. Jars of hardware bore careful labels in a spidery, elegant hand. This was her space. I knew it the way you know a thing in your bones. I ran my fingers across the scarred wooden surface, tracing grooves and nicks worn by a lifetime of work. My flashlight caught something metallic. Hidden behind a row of jars sat a small tin box, the kind once used for tea or biscuits. Faded bluebirds decorated its surface. No lock. My fingers, stiff and numb from the cold, pried the lid open. Inside, resting on yellowed cotton, lay a single photograph and a folded slip of paper. Black and white, edges curled with age. A young woman with dark, wavy hair and a smile that was shy and defiant at once. She held a baby. The woman had my eyes. Bill had been right. Eleanor, my grandmother. And the baby was my mother. I stared at that image while something strange and deep ached open in my chest. First photograph I had ever seen of my mother as an infant. First evidence that she had once been small, brand new, cradled in the arms of someone who loved her. I unfolded the paper, the same elegant handwriting as the labels on the jars. It read, "For my little bird, should you ever need to find your way home, the heart of the house is not in the house. It's where the work is done. Trust the grain." I read those words 3 times. 4. The heart of the house is not in the house. Trust the grain. A riddle, a clue. My grandmother hadn't abandoned me to nothing. She had left me a puzzle. Hope, thin, fragile, barely breathing, sparked to life somewhere beneath my ribs. This wasn't random debris. This was a message. I swept the flashlight across the workbench again. Different eyes now, purpose burning behind them. I wasn't browsing anymore. I was hunting. Where the work is done. The workbench. Right here. Trust the grain. I studied the thick oak bench top. Several wide planks joined together, the grain flowing in beautiful patterns of dark and light. My fingers traced the surface slowly, searching for anything wrong. A loose board, a hidden seam. Nothing. I shifted the light toward the front. Several drawers lined the face of the bench. One by one, I yanked them open. Tools, coils of wire, spare parts, all ordinary. I nearly quit. Then the flashlight caught something subtle near the floor. One of the heavy legs supporting the bench was built from laminated pieces of wood. On one side, the grain didn't match, nearly invisible. The kind of flaw you'd never notice unless you were desperate to find it. I dropped to my knees on the frozen ground. My pulse hammered. I pressed the mismatched section. Solid, immovable. I traced the seam with my fingertips, searching for a latch, a button, a trigger. Nothing. Trust the grain. I leaned closer. The wood grain ran downward, but in one tiny spot, a natural knot created a small swirl, no bigger than my thumb. Instinct took over. I pressed my thumb into the center of that knot. A faint click. The section with the mismatched grain popped open, just an inch. Not a drawer, a hidden compartment, deep, a dark cavity hollowed into the solid wood of the bench leg. I reached inside. My fingers touched something smooth, cold, heavy. I pulled it free. A leather-bound journal. My grandmother's journal. This was it, the heart, the story I had spent my entire life waiting to hear. I sat on the frozen ground, the weak flashlight beam trembling across the worn leather cover, and opened the first page. Elegant, spidery script filled every line. As I began to read, the cold fell away, the dark loosened its grip. The crushing weight of my own loneliness lifted, replaced by the voice of a woman I had never known, a woman who was about to change everything. My hands shook around the journal. The first entry was dated over 30 years ago, ink slightly faded, but the words burned clear. A love so fierce it radiated physical warmth against the barn's deep chill. Quote, 39, it began, my mother's name. You arrived today, a screaming, beautiful miracle. Holding you, I feel like I finally understand what the sun is for. You are everything. Page after page. My mother's first steps, her first words. The funny way she butchered the word spaghetti. I saw my mother, not the tragic figure erased by a car accident, but a vibrant, laughing child, cherished, adored. My grandmother's love for her daughter spilled from every sentence. But as the years turned in that journal, something shifted. A new name crept onto the pages. Rick, my father. Eleanor's first mentions of him carried a cautious warmth. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 41, underscore, underscore. That prayer went unanswered. Hope soured into dread. The entries grew shorter, clipped, guarded. Quote, 42. My throat closed around a breath I couldn't finish. I knew my father had a temper. Dim, smoke-colored memories lived in me, shouting that rattled walls, my mother's muffled sobs. But I never understood the full scope. My grandmother witnessed every stage of it. She documented her pleas, her desperate campaigns to pull my mother free, to bring her home. But my mother was snared, pinned between devotion and terror, repeating his apologies back like prayers, swearing he'd change. Then came the entry about me. Sarah is pregnant. She told me today, with eyes full of desperate, terrified hope. She believes a baby will heal him. I know better. A child won't save him. It will only hand him another weapon, another soul to shatter. I have to act. I cannot watch him destroy this one too. I set the journal down. Couldn't read another word. Nausea and grief rolled through me in one thick wave. I sat motionless in the dark, flashlight beam shaking in my grip, cold earth pulling the warmth from my bones. Everything I'd believed was wrong. I had built a story where my grandmother was the villain, the one who turned away, who didn't care. The truth was the opposite. She had been fighting, watching from the margins, heart fracturing in slow motion. The journal laid out her plan in painstaking detail. Eleanor began hoarding money, selling off pieces of the farm, building an escape route for my mother and me. But Rick tightened his grip, grew more paranoid. He severed my mother from her family, dragged her from town to town like cargo. Eleanor's letters came back unopened. Her calls rang into nothing. Then a darker thread wove itself into the pages. Rick had entangled himself with a man named Arthur Blackwood, founder of Blackwood and Sons. My blood turned to ice water. This was no accident. They weren't simply developers. Eleanor's journal revealed Blackwood operated a loan-sharking ring beneath that polished surface, feeding on desperate people. Rick owed him heavily, and Blackwood converted that debt into servitude, forcing Rick to intimidate, to run errands no honest person would touch. The barn. This land. It sat in my grandmother's name, the one asset Rick couldn't reach. Blackwood wanted it, saw it as payment for Rick's mounting debt. He leaned on Rick to pressure Eleanor into selling. __quote _44__1 entry read __quote _45 __. The final entries came in jagged, trembling handwriting. My parents were dead. Eleanor poured her grief onto those pages, a devastation so raw it bled through the paper into my hands. But tangled through that grief was something worse. Guilt. __quote _46 __. After the accident, she fought for custody. Blackwood crushed that fight before it started. He had roots in the system, connections. He painted Eleanor as unstable, a reclusive old woman, unfit to raise anyone's child. He made certain I vanished into foster care, swallowed whole by the state. He did it with surgical precision. Isolate the girl, sever every thread connecting her to the truth. Let her grow up believing she was abandoned, unwanted. Then, when she turns 18, broke, desperate, alone, she'll sell the one thing he could never take by force. My grandmother's land. A long game. Patient. Merciless. And I had been the pawn at its center. I shut the journal. My entire body vibrated with a rage so pure and cold it felt like swallowing shards of ice. They hadn't merely dismissed my inheritance, they had engineered my entire childhood of isolation and loss, manufactured every lonely night, just to pry this land from my hands. The grief I felt for the grandmother I never knew was bottomless. She hadn't abandoned me. She'd been shielding me from beyond the grave. The journal, the key, this barn. None of it was an inheritance. It was a weapon cache. And sitting there, in the dust and silence, something turned over inside me. Fear still lived in my chest, but it had changed shape, sharpened to a blade, become fuel. Have you ever stood in a moment like that? Everything you believed, inverted. The world snapping into focus so clear it terrifies you. That kind of moment either shatters a person or hammers them into something harder. If you've walked through that fire, I need you to hear this. You are not alone. Hit subscribe, drop a comment, let us know you're here, because what follows is the part where I stopped being a piece on someone else's board. I chose to fight. The rage kept me warm through the night. Sleep never came. I sat curled in the barn's darkness, a wool blanket from an old trunk draped over my shoulders, and read the journal front to back. Then read it again. I was memorizing my own history, arming myself with truth. Grey dawn crept through the cracks in the barn walls, and in the journal's final pages, I found what I needed. My grandmother was no victim. She was a soldier. She knew Blackwood was a criminal, but she couldn't prove it. Local police belonged to him, so she built her own case. Quote 47. Quote she wrote. Quote 48. Quote for Sarah. And for me. The journal never said where she stashed the evidence, but the very last page offered one more clue, scrawled in a faltering hand, likely days before she died. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore 49, underscore, underscore. I rose, joints stiff, bones aching from cold. The barn didn't sit on a modern concrete slab. It rested on massive granite blocks, pulled from the very quarry Blackwood now used for his midnight operations. I grabbed a heavy iron pry bar from the workbench and moved toward the walled-off room at the back, the one I'd noticed earlier. Maybe her workshop once, maybe a root cellar. Small, 10 feet by 10 feet at most. I tapped each stone, listening. Thud, 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 all solid. I was ready to quit when one stone caught my eye. Dead center of the room, same size as the others, same color, but its edge carried a small, deliberate mark, a tiny crescent moon carved into the surface. The note from the tin box flashed through my mind. Trust the grain. Same principle. A flaw that wasn't a flaw, a sign disguised as imperfection. I jammed the pry bar into the crack beside the marked stone, leaned every pound I had into it. Nothing. The iron groaned. My muscles burned white. Then, a low, grinding moan of stone dragging against earth. The flagstone shifted, rose. Thick granite slab, heavier than anything I'd moved in my life. Beneath it, a dark, square opening, a cavity lined with metal, a small, fireproof safe buried in the ground beneath the floor. Resting on top of the safe was an envelope, sealed, my name written across it in ink. Ara. I sank back on my heels, heart slamming against my ribs. This was the final piece, the real inheritance. I tore the envelope open. Several pages inside, covered in that familiar, elegant script. Quote, 50 quote, it began. Quote, 51, quote. She laid it all out. Blackwood's operation ran deeper than loan sharking. He'd been using the quarry as a dump site for illegal industrial waste, poisoning the water table beneath the entire region. Her farm. My farm. It sat on one of the last clean wells around. That was the prize. Not the dirt, not the timber, the water rights. His plan was surgical and patient. Acquire her property, contaminate the well, then sell the remediation contract back to the state for millions. All while the dumping continued in shadow. A scheme built on decades of patience and cruelty. The safe, she explained, held everything. intercepted shipping manifests, photographs of barrels being rolled into the quarry at night, water samples she'd had tested in secret, and a meticulous ledger documenting every one of Blackwood's loan sharking victims, my father among them, enough to destroy him completely. 52, she wrote. 53. My lungs forgot how to work. $50,000. A number so far beyond anything I'd known, it barely registered as real. It was safety. Security. A clean start. Everything I'd spent my whole life aching for. Quote 54. The letter continued. Quote 55. The letter closed with a single line that split me open. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 56, underscore, underscore. I broke. I sank to the floor of that frigid, lightless barn and wept. For the mother who was barely a shadow in my memory. For the grandmother I never got to touch. For the terrified little girl who had shuffled between strangers her whole life. And for the woman that little girl now had no choice but to become. The decisions sat before me, clean, brutal, undeniable. Freedom or justice, running or fighting, the easy wrong or the harder right. I looked at the safe, then at the paper shaking in my grip. I thought about Mrs. Gable's weary pity, the kids laughing at my dollar cabin inheritance, Mark Corian's smile, that slick, hungry smile. Every one of them had looked right through me. They saw a throwaway kid from the system. None of them knew I was Eleanor Vance's granddaughter. I reached into the hole and pressed my palm against the cold metal dial. The combination was there in the letter, but my mind was already past the question. The money meant nothing. The barn wasn't a burden, and it wasn't a windfall. It was a battlefield. My grandmother had handed me the weapons and drawn the map. I was going to finish what she started. The safe fought me, dense, stubborn iron, but I hauled it from the ground, carried it to the workbench with arms that screamed. The combination she'd left was a string of numbers, meaningless at first. Then it hit me. My mother's birthday. My fingers trembled against the dial. Right, left, right. The last digit locked into place. A deep, metallic clunk. Bolts sliding free. I pulled the heavy door wide. Everything she promised was there. On one side, a metal cash box crammed tight with $100 bills. Even a glance confirmed it. Tens of thousands. Enough to disappear and start over anywhere on Earth. On the other side, a thick, waterproof portfolio. The evidence. I didn't pause, didn't waver. I shoved the cash box aside and lifted the portfolio free. It was heavy, not just with paper, but with years of my grandmother's silent, relentless war. Staying in the barn was out of the question. Corian's people knew I was here. They'd probably been watching this property for months. And now I held the one thing that terrified them. This was the most dangerous place on Earth for me. I packed a small bag, the journal, the portfolio. The cash box stayed locked in the safe. Taking it felt wrong. That money was hers, saved for a future I was now choosing to walk past. This was never about getting rich. It was about settling the score. I had to reach Ben Thompson. I slipped through the barn's rear exit, using the dense pines as cover while I pushed toward the road, staying clear of the open trail. Snow kept falling, erasing my footprints almost the moment I left them. 3 miles back to town on foot. Brutal. The cold wasn't weather, it was a living thing, raking across exposed skin, stealing air from my lungs mid-breath. Every twig snap in those woods sounded like someone closing the distance behind me. Every shadow held teeth. I wasn't some lost kid anymore. I was a target. By the time Northwood's edge came into view, exhaustion owned my body and ice owned everything else. But something harder than the cold had locked itself into my gut. Resolve, sharp as a blade. Thompson Law wasn't hard to find. A modest little building wedged between the diner and a hardware store. I drew one long breath and shoved the door open. Inside, warmth, silence, the smell of aging paper and fresh coffee. A young man glanced up from his desk, kind eyes, slightly wrinkled suit.
Early 30s, maybe. "Can I help you?" he asked.
"Are you Ben Thompson?" Barely a whisper from my throat. "I am." "My name is Ara Vance. My grandmother was Eleanor Vance. She told me I should trust you." I set the heavy portfolio on his desk.
Ben Thompson's face changed.
Polite curiosity drained away, replaced by something sharp, something grave. He looked at the portfolio, then at me, and somehow understood everything without a single explanation. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 61, underscore, underscore, he said quietly. He stood, crossed to the front door, locked it, flipped the sign to closed. Then he guided me to a chair beside a small fireplace, peeled my frozen coat from my shoulders, and pressed a hot mug of coffee into my hands. Quote 62, he said, voice low and deliberate. Quote 63. She made him promise to help me, no matter what. He settled into the chair across from mine, eyes locked on me, unblinking. She also told him to warn me. Arthur Blackwood is a dangerous man. Once we crack open this portfolio, there is no turning back. Was I sure I was ready for this? I stared into the fire, watched flames curl and writhe. I thought of my grandmother's handwriting, elegant, defiant. We are not defined by what is taken from us, but by what we choose to protect. "I'm sure," I said, voice clear, steady. "Let's get to work." The rest of that day vanished inside his office. Ben laid the portfolio's contents across a wide mahogany desk. What spread before us was worse than anything I'd imagined. Dated photographs, crisp and damning, showing trucks bearing the Blackwood & Sons logo, dumping barrels into the quarry under cover of darkness. Shipping manifests for toxic chemicals, each one cross-referenced against the dumping dates. Water test results revealing contamination levels far beyond safe thresholds. Flowing downstream from the quarry straight toward the town's water supply. And then, the ledger. Dozens of names, local people snared in endless debt to Blackwood. My father's name sat high on that list, every page meticulous, every detail catalogued with surgical precision. My grandmother had been a brilliant, patient investigator. This is incredible," Ben breathed, his professional composure fracturing under the weight of what lay before him. "This is more than enough. This won't just stop him. This will put him away for a very long time." He looked up at me, something new behind his eyes. Respect. "Your grandmother was a remarkable woman." Pride surged through me so fierce it nearly cracked me open. She wasn't the crazy old hermit this town had whispered about. She was a hero. While Ben started making copies and drafting legal notices, he set me up in a spare room above the office. Being alone wasn't safe anymore. The next morning, the first shot was fired. Ben filed a sweeping injunction against Blackwood and Sons, citing environmental contamination. Simultaneously, copies of the evidence landed on desks at the State Environmental Protection Agency and the FBI. The response was instant. By noon, state police cruisers swarmed the quarry. Mark Corian appeared at Ben's office door, that polished mask ripped clean off, nothing underneath but raw fury. He tried threats, intimidation, told me I had no idea who I was dealing with. I just looked at him, said nothing. My silence hit harder than any words could have. He saw Eleanor in my eyes, and he knew he had lost. The fight wasn't finished, but momentum had shifted. The story hit local news first, then climbed to the state level. The reclusive old woman's granddaughter had returned and cracked open the town's ugliest secret. Northwood started seeing me through different eyes. The whispers changed. Not pity anymore, shock. Then gratitude. Families whose wells had turned poisonous, whose kids carried illnesses no doctor could explain, began stepping forward. My grandmother's ledger handed them their voice. This wasn't just my family's war anymore, it belonged to the whole town. For weeks I lived in that cramped room, helping Ben build the case brick by brick. I gave my statement to the FBI. I memorized the names of every family Blackwood had destroyed. And in the still moments, I'd walk to the barn. The haunted feeling was gone. Something sacred had replaced it. I began restoring it. Slow, deliberate work. Swept the floors, cleaned every tool, patched the hole torn through the roof. More of her things surfaced. Botany textbooks, pencil sketches of birds, a wood carving left half done. Each find was a quiet dialogue with the woman who'd saved my life. I was learning her in fragments. I was finally home. The legal grind stretched across months. Depositions, hearings, motions filed and counted. Blackwood fought hard. He brought in high-dollar city attorneys who painted me as a delusional, money-hungry teenager, and my grandmother as some unhinged recluse. The evidence didn't care about their narrative. Photographs don't negotiate. Water samples don't bend. The ledger, backed by dozens of corroborating witnesses, stood like a wall they couldn't breach. His defenses fell apart, one by one. Arthur Blackwood caught a string of federal indictments, illegal dumping, racketeering, fraud. His company buckled beneath lawsuits and penalties. The empire, held together by lies, collapsed. Exactly the way my grandmother said it would. The day of his sentencing, I sat in that courtroom and watched. He looked shrunken, old, all that power, gone. He never once turned my direction, but I could feel his hatred radiating across the room. It didn't matter. It couldn't reach me anymore. When the legal war ended, silence moved in. The future, once a terrifying void, stretched ahead like an open road. Northwood, which had felt so foreign, was becoming familiar. Bill saved me the newspaper every morning. The diner waitress had my coffee memorized. Carl made sure Ridge Road got plowed first after every storm. I wasn't the outsider anymore. I was Eleanor's girl. I made my decision. The land wasn't for sale. The $50,000 from the safe, now locked in a bank vault, would stay untouched. I was staying. I was bringing that barn back. I used a modest portion of the money to hire a local crew. We tore out the sagging roof and replaced it, fixed the crooked doors, cut in new windows, ran electricity, ran plumbing. Slowly, stubbornly, The rotting shell transformed. It became something luminous, a workshop, a home, a living thing. The workbench stayed at the center, her workbench. Her tools hung on the pegboard, her jars of nails and screws lined the shelves. Some evenings, sanding a rough plank or tightening a loose hinge, I swore I could feel her standing just behind me, a quiet nod. My inheritance was never the acre of land or the barn or the cash. It was the choice she planted in my hands. Run or fight. Be the victim of my story or its author. She taught me that a thing's value isn't measured by what someone offers to pay. It's measured by what you're willing to protect. She taught me that home isn't handed to you, it's built, defended, earned. Standing in the doorway of my finished barn, staring across snow-blanketed Vermont hills, the truth finally settled into my bones. I wasn't a ghost anymore. I had roots, driven deep into this cold, stubborn ground, tangled with the memory of a woman I never met, but who gave me everything she had. Her strength became my foundation. Her love became my anchor, worth more than any fortune on earth. And so my real story in Northwood began. Not an ending, a beginning. A story of rebuilding, not just a barn, but an entire life. It's about how the smallest, most dismissed things carry the greatest force. That lesson was waiting for me in a dusty barn. I carry it every single day. And I want to pass it to you, because I believe we all have our own version of that barn.
Something in our lives that others wave off.
Something that looks worthless on the surface, but holds a quiet strength inside it. A buried history, a truth sitting patient, waiting to be found. So what's your barn? What's the thing everyone told you was a weakness? That might actually be your greatest weapon. Sit with that for a moment, and if you're willing, share it. The comments section here isn't just a feed, it's a gathering place, a room full of people who know exactly what it feels like to be written off. I read every single one. Your stories matter. They're threads in something larger we're weaving together. If my journey gave you even a sliver of hope, even a small push toward facing your own fight, then subscribe and become part of this community. Because we all deserve a place where we can trust the grain, find the foundation, and build a home for ourselves, no matter where we started. Thank you for listening.